September 16th, 1943 Bougainville, Solomon Islands. Captain James Jimmy Sweat watches his wingman die. The F-4U Corsair ahead of him bursts into flame, spirals down into the green wall of jungle, and vanishes in a pillar of smoke. The radio crackles once a scream, cut short, then silence. Just another black smear on the islands, endless horizon of fire and ocean. That's the third aircraft VMF 213 has lost this week. Not to mechanical failure, not even to superior Japanese tactics, but to something humiliating wasted ammunition. Sweat knows it because he's seen it with his own eyes. Frame by frame, in his gun camera footage, he fired over 400 rounds at a zero at 300 yards. Every tracer surrounded the enemy in a perfect glowing halo above it, below it, to both sides, but not one bullet hit. 2 minutes later, that same zero shot down his friend. Across the Pacific, the numbers are grim. Corsairs are burning through 3,000 rounds per mission. 25 seconds of total firing time, and still achieving barely a 3-to-1 kill ratio. A machine built to dominate the skies is being outgunned by lighter, slower Japanese planes. Sweat's unit, Marine Fighter Squadron 213, the Hellhawks holds one of the worst ammunition-to-kill ratios in the entire theater, nearly 900 bullets per confirmed. Enemy aircraft destroyed. It's not the pilots. These are combat-tested men with nerves of steel. It's not the guns either. 6 Browning, 50 calibers capable of shredding anything that crosses their path. The problem hides somewhere else in a line of factory numbers. A geometry of angles buried in a technical manual no one reads. The engineers at Vought had set the Corsair's gun convergence, the point where all 6 streams of bullets meet at 1,000 feet. In theory, that's where a skilled pilot would want his fire to intersect. Far enough to give time to aim and lead a target, wide enough to make a forgiving cone of fire. But in real combat, it's a death sentence, because no one fights at 1,000 feet anymore. Battles are fast, chaotic, swirling between 200 and 400 yards. At that range, the Corsair's guns, spaced 16 feet apart along its wings, spread their fire into a circle nearly 20 feet wide. A Zero's wingspan is only 29. Pilots aren't missing because they can't shoot. They're missing because they're threading bullets through empty air. The footage doesn't lie. Bullets punch the ocean, soar through trees, draw white scars across clouds. The air fills with the sound of effort, not results. When pilots return, their gun barrels smoke and their ammunition drums are empty, but the enemy's still alive. Japanese intelligence notices. Intercepted radio chatter mocks the Americans. Their bullets scatter like rain. Stay close. When their guns empty, attack. And that's exactly what happens. Zeros. Bait Corsairs into firing early, weaving just enough to survive the opening burst, then turning to kill once the Americans run dry. For General Roy Geiger, commander of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, the Solomon Islands campaign is collapsing one bullet at a time without reliable air cover. the Navy's amphibious assaults will grind to a halt. Every day without a solution means more pilots lost, more bombers reaching targets unopposed, more names written on telegrams sent home. So orders go out across the squadrons. Find the problem. Fix the accuracy. Improve the kill ratio now. But none of the usual answers work. The planes fly perfectly. The guns fire perfectly. The ammo feeds perfectly. And yet the enemy keeps flying away. Lieutenant Colonel William Millington, the operations officer, issues a memo that seems final. Gun convergence below 500 feet exceeds safe structural limits for the F-4U airframe. Pilots must engage targets at optimal range. Optimal range. As if war obeyed memos. The order means stop complaining. It means die properly. By mid-September, pilots begin to dread the sound of their own guns, the roar that means they'll soon be defenseless. Sweat himself starts seeing ghosts when he aims. The outline of a zero just out of reach, the curve of a wing sliding through his tracers untouched. He starts to wonder if the ocean itself is eating his bullets. The frustration becomes a kind of madness on the flight line. Mechanics polish barrels that don't need polishing. Pilots swear they'll quit if they survive another mission. Someone paints a skull on the nose of a Corsair with the words "scatter" shot under it. Gallows humor, the last defense against helplessness. Then, one morning, in a maintenance tent heavy with the smell of oil and cordite, a man who's not a pilot and not an engineer watches the same gun camera footage as everyone else. He's just a staff sergeant, 26 years old. Short, compact, South Boston accent that still carries through the tropical heat. His name is Michael Joseph, Mickey McCarthy, Aviation Ordnance Crew, the guy who loads the guns, cleans the shell casings, and tightens bolts so they don't rattle loose in flight. He isn't supposed to have opinions on tactics or design. His job is maintenance, not miracles. But as he rewinds the footage of Sweat's wasted burst, something clicks. He sees the tracers spread wide, sees the pilot fire too early, and realizes that every bullet's traveling too long, too far, before reaching the target had the geometries wrong. The war is being lost to a number in a manual outside. The Pacific heat shimmers over the airstrip, and the Corsairs gleam like wounded birds. Somewhere above the clouds, Japanese fighters hunt. Somewhere in that sky, men will die today because the bullets they fire won't meet where they should. McCarthy looks down at his grease-stained hands, the same hands that have built carburetors, fixed engines, and tuned machines since he was a teenager. He's not an officer, but he knows machinery. He knows when something's out of tune. And in that moment, he decides that if the pilots can't fix their aim, maybe the wrench turners will. He wipes the sweat from his face and heads toward the armory, where a small stack of technical manuals waits thick, unread, and full of answers nobody else seems willing to see. Tomorrow, hell open one, and the war in the Pacific will quietly begin to tilt. Mickey McCarthy wasn't supposed to think. At least, not in the way that officers and engineers did. His role was simple. Load ammunition, maintain firing systems, clean up shell casings. Yet when he looked at those corsairs lined up on the tarmac, each one carrying 6 machine guns and a reputation it wasn't living up to, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong and that he might be the only one willing to fix it. Had grown up in South Boston, in a garage that smelled of gasoline and cheap coffee. His father taught him how to rebuild engines before he could drive them. If something's built by man, his father used to say, it can be rebuilt by another man, usually better. McCarthy never forgot that. When the Depression hit and work dried up, he joined the Marines mostly for the steady meals. He never dreamed he'd one day be staring down the blueprints of a fighter aircraft that was losing a war. But war has a way of finding its own mechanics. For 8 months, Head served with VMF 213, a quiet, unshakable presence on the flight line. The pilots trusted him because their guns never jammed, their ammo always fed cleanly. They didn't know he spent nights studying gun camera footage like it was film school. He saw patterns, missed shots forming perfect halos, tracers wrapping neatly around enemy planes. He could almost hear the wasted potential screaming from each frame. So one night, when the air cooled and the maintenance tent emptied, McCarthy walked to the armory. "Let me see the Corsair technical manual," he asked the clerk. The man looked at him as if Head asked for a Bible in Latin. "You don't need that, Mickey," the clerk muttered. "That's engineering stuff." McCarthy just smiled. "Maybe I am feeling holy tonight." He spent hours hunched over the manual, tracing the diagrams of gun mounts with his finger. 6 50 caliber Brownings, 3 on each wing, angled slightly inward so their bullets converged at a single point, 1,000 feet ahead of the nose. He read the justification. Engineers believed that at that distance, a pilot had enough time to lead and sustain fire. Optimum for aerial engagement, the manual said. It sounded reasonable on paper, but McCarthy didn't live on paper. He lived in a world where bullets traveled slower than sound and planes moved faster than thought. He grabbed a pencil and started doing math on the back of a maintenance form, the kind with greasy thumbprints already on it. At 1,000 feet, a 50 caliber bullet takes roughly 1 second to reach its target. A Japanese Zero, flying at 300 miles per hour, moves 440 feet in that same second. Even if a pilot led perfectly, the target was already gone before the bullets arrived. But what if convergence was closer, say 300 feet? Then the bullets would arrive in about a third of a second and the target would only move 50 feet. Lead time shrinks, accuracy spikes, and the bullets concentrate like a single, solid beam. He ran the numbers again and again. 6 guns, each firing 800 rounds per minute, 40,000 foot-pounds of energy per second, all converging in a space the size of a dinner plate. He imagined what that would do to a 5,000-pound Zero made of thin aluminum. It wouldn't just hit, it would disintegrate. He laughed quietly to himself. It sounded insane. Brilliant, but insane. Then the reality hit him. It was also illegal. There was a reason the engineers had forbidden convergence closer than 500 feet. The Corsair's guns were mounted far out on the wings. Angling them inward too sharply meant dangerous stress on the gun brackets. Under recoil, those brackets could crack, the wings could warp, and the aircraft might shake itself apart in mid-air. The bureaucracy had already decided the risk wasn't worth it. But that bureaucracy wasn't watching pilots burn in the jungle. McCarthy closed the manual and stared out toward the flight line. The moonlight glinted off the Corsair's folded wings like a row of silent tombstones. He thought of Sweat. The young Captain Hwad watched his friend die because his tracers couldn't find their mark. He thought of the memo from Colonel Millington forbidding low convergence, and he thought of all the wasted bullets lying somewhere out in the Pacific, floating like ghosts if the engineers wouldn't fix it. Maybe a sergeant could. The next morning, McCarthy cornered Sweat near the maintenance tent. "Sir, can I ask about your last engagement?" Sweat frowned. "If this is about my guns, they're fine. I've seen your footage," McCarthy said quietly. "You're not missing, the bullets are." Sweat blinked, half offended, half curious. "What the hell does that mean?" "Your convergence is too far," McCarthy replied. "At 1,000 feet, you're firing through an empty circle. I think we can tighten it to 300. Sweat stared. "That's below the structural limit." "Yes, sir," McCarthy said, "but it might also save lives." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that carries the weight of every regulation ever written. Sweat finally shook his head and walked away. "I appreciate the thought, Sergeant, but you and I both like breathing air, not court-martial dust." McCarthy nodded, but inside, something hardened. Had done the math. He knew he was right. He didn't need permission to be correct. That night, he returned to the hangar after lights out. Corporal Eddie Wilkins and Private Tommy Reyes, two young ordnance men who trusted McCarthy more than they feared. The rules followed him inside. Together, they rolled Captain Sweat's Corsair Bureau No. 1, 7883, into the shadows. McCarthy grabbed a flashlight and a wrench. The light swept over the gun mounts, steel ribs glinting in the dark. He ran his hand along the cold barrels and whispered, "Let's make you meaner." He measured the angles, adjusted bolts, and marked the new trajectory lines on masking tape. To compensate for recoil stress, he cut pieces of scrap steel from a damaged wing panel, filed them into crude reinforcement plates, and welded them by hand. Sparks flew like fireflies around the hangar. Sweat and regulations could wait. Tonight was for invention. By 4 a.m., the work was done. McCarthy stepped back, covered in sweat and soot, and looked at the result. 6 barrels angled inward, like claws closing for the kill. It looked wrong beautifully, dangerously wrong. He didn't bother to file a report. He didn't need approval. The next time Captain Sweat fired these guns, the Pacific would learn what happens when a mechanic stops following orders. The morning broke in heat and silence. The smell of salt hung heavy over the tarmac, mingled with the sharp sting of aviation fuel. Mechanics moved slowly, bleary-eyed from another night of patching bullet holes. Captain Sweat walked toward his Corsair, helmet tucked under one arm, a cigarette in his mouth. He froze when he saw it. The barrels. They were wrong. Angled inward, more than head, ever seen just enough to look dangerous. He found McCarthy standing by the wing, hands behind his back, trying to look casual. "Sergeant," Sweat said slowly, "what did you do to my guns?" McCarthy snapped to attention. "Adjusted your convergence, sir." Sweat squinted. "To what distance?" 300 feet, sir." The words landed like a thunderclap. Sweat's cigarette fell to the ground. 300? That's against regulation. Yes, sir. There was a long, deadly pause between them. The kind where two men decide if they're about to ruin each other's lives. Sweat finally muttered, "You realize if this doesn't work, we're both done." McCarthy met his eyes without flinching. "Yes, sir. But if it does work, you'll kill everything you look at." Sweat's lips twitched, almost a smile. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and said nothing more. At 8:30 hours, 4 Corsairs from VMF 213 took off from the runway at Torokina Airfield for a combat patrol. The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath them, blue, silent, waiting. They climbed to 18,000 feet. The radio chatter was thin and routine until the tone shifted. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. 9 zeros. 6 dive bombers behind. 4 against 15. Terrible odds. Sweat dove first. The modified Corsair screamed through cloud and sunlight, closing fast on the rearmost zero. Normally, he would have started firing at 600 yards. Not today. He waited, steadying his nerves, watching the distance collapse. 500, 400, 350. He felt the vibration of the engine. The whine of air past the canopy at 320 feet. The zero filled his gun sight. He pressed the trigger. 80 rounds left the barrels in a 1-second burst. A wall of lead so dense it looked solid. The zero didn't burst into smoke or flame. It came apart. The entire tail section snapped clean off. The fuselage twisted and vanished into fragments. Sweat yanked the stick to avoid flying through the wreckage. His breath caught in his throat. Holy Mother of He started, but stopped, already rolling for another target. Second zero. 300 feet, 1 second burst. The left wing ripped away. The plane spun inverted, spiraling into the sea. Third zero, 280 feet, half-second burst. The canopy shattered. The pilot's body slumped forward as his aircraft nosed into a death spin. 3 kills in 45 seconds. 200 rounds fired. When Sweat and the others returned to base 4 minutes later, they'd destroyed 8 Japanese aircraft. VMF 213 had lost 1. Sweat personally accounted for 5 kills, the best ratio in the Pacific to date, and still had more than half his ammunition left. When he taxied in, there was already a crowd waiting. Pilots, mechanics, officers. They stood silent, staring at the gun barrels that still smoked faintly in the Sunday. Sweat climbed down, his flight suit soaked with sweat. McCarthy was there, trying to read his face. "Well?" he asked. Sweat didn't answer. He just raised a trembling hand, half laugh, half disbelief. "Sergeant, I think you broke physics." The silence broke into a wave of voices. Major Wade Britt, the squadron commander, pushed through the crowd. "What did you do to this plane?" he demanded. McCarthy stood straight. "Adjusted the convergence to 300 feet, sir." 300? Britt repeated. "Flat." "You're aware that's below the structural safety limit?" "Yes, sir." "You're aware you modified military equipment without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Did you file a modification request?" "No, sir." By then, the operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Millington, the man who'd written the memo forbidding low convergence, had arrived, face red with fury. "This is a direct violation of standing orders," he shouted. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You could have caused a catastrophic structural failure." Major Britt raised a hand, calm but sharp. "Colonel, with respect." The aircraft flew and returned intact. "One flight proves nothing." Millington snapped. "Stress fractures develop over time. This sergeant has endangered lives and defied the chain of command." Captain Sweat stepped forward. Voice cold and steady. "Sir, I just shot down 5 Japanese aircraft with 200 rounds. Before today, I needed 400 rounds. To maybe hit 1. I still have 1,800 left." Millington opened his mouth, but Sweat wasn't finished. "You can court-martial us later, sir. But right now, I suggest you let him keep fixing our guns." Lieutenant Robert Hanson, another pilot, stepped out of the crowd. "Permission to have my guns modified the same way." "Denied," Millington barked. "Sir," Hanson persisted, "we're dying out there because we can't hit anything." McCarthy just proved this works. The argument swelled, officers citing regulations, pilots shouting for their lives. Words like court-martial, insubordination, unsafe filled the air. Major Britt let it go for 2 minutes, then blew a sharp whistle. The noise sliced through the chaos. "Enough!" He turned to McCarthy. "Sergeant, can you modify every Corsair in this squadron by tomorrow morning?" Millington exploded. "You cannot authorize that. I'll report this directly to General Geiger." "Good," Britt said quietly. "Save me the trouble." He looked back at McCarthy. "Can you do it?" McCarthy's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir, I can do it." "Then do it," Britt said. "Every plane, 300 feet convergence, tonight." Millington stormed off, shouting about insubordination. Britt didn't care. The line had been drawn between the men who fought on paper and the men who fought in the air. As the sun set, McCarthy rolled up his sleeves. The hangar roared to life sparks flying, wrenches clanging, torches lighting the night. 22 Corsairs waited in silence, wings like folded fists. By dawn, every single one would be armed for vengeance. And the Pacific was about to discover what happens when the Marines stop missing. Night fell on the maintenance hangars like a curtain drawn over a secret. Inside, Sparks danced against metal as McCarthy and his crew worked through the humid dark. Sweat stung their eyes, the smell of oil and ozone thick in their lungs. One after another, the corsairs were pulled into the hangar and reborn under the hiss of torches, their wings stiff with new steel plates, their guns re-angled to strike at 300 feet. By dawn, 22 aircraft stood ready, lined up like silent executioners. Their guns glinted faintly in the early sun, the barrels now tilting inward, just enough to look unnatural, almost predatory. To anyone who hadn't seen what those angles could do, it would have looked like a mistake. At 11:40 a.m., September 20th, 1943, the test came. 8 of VMF 213 seconds newly modified Corsairs lifted from the runway at Empress Augusta Bay, climbing into a sky mottled with white cloud. Radio intercepts had picked up another incoming raid. 12 Zeros and 8 Mitsubishi Betty bombers. 20 enemy aircraft. Twice their number. Lieutenant Robert Hansen, in one of the freshly tuned Corsairs, spotted them first tiny black flecks against the silver ocean. The Bettys lumbered in formation, Zeros darting above them like watchful hawks. Hansen tightened his grip on the control stick, feeling the vibration of 6 .50 calibers waiting to speak. "Hellhawks, this is 1-to-1, he said over the radio. "Let's test Sergeant McCarthy's miracle." He dove. The Betty filled his sight at 400 yards. Normally, that's when you started firing when you hoped your tracers would connect. Hansen held. 3503, 203, 00. His thumb pressed the trigger. A 2-second burst, 160 rounds, ripped from the guns in a single luminous ribbon. The Betty's right engine exploded instantly. The wing folded upward like paper in a bonfire. The bomber dropped out of the sky, trailing a column of flame 300 feet long. "Jesus Christ," Hansen muttered, leveling out. He banked left, lined up a 0 coming to intercept, and squeezed again 1 second, 80 rounds. The Zero's cockpit simply vanished. Glass and blood, atomized in a flash of orange. The aircraft nosed over and spiraled into the sea. 2 kills, 15 seconds, 240 rounds. All across the sky, it was the same. Corsairs were no longer spraying the air, they were carving it. Bursts that once scattered now sliced through enemy wings, detonated fuel tanks, erased entire aircraft in single trigger pulls. The Japanese formation disintegrated in less than 12 minutes. When the last Betty hit the water, the Hellhawks regrouped. 15 confirmed kills, 0 losses. Back at base, the celebration was silent at first, disbelief masquerading as calm. Mechanics stood frozen as planes taxied in with their ammo drums still half full. No one dared say it aloud, but the math was staggering. Ammunition expenditure per kill had dropped from 900 rounds to under 200. In one mission, McCarthy's modification had multiplied Marine lethality by 5. That night, word spread like wildfire across the Solomons. Other squadrons radioed in for details. What's the setting? How close? Are the wings holding? The answer, yes. They were holding beautifully. The reinforcement plates McCarthy had welded by hand were working crude, ugly, but indestructible. By September 22nd, every Marine fighter unit in the Solomons was requesting the 300-foot modification. By the 25th, even Pappy Boyington's legendary Black Sheep Squadron, VMF 214, had adopted it. Japanese intelligence noticed the shift almost immediately. Radio transcripts intercepted by Navy code breakers carried a new tone of panic. The American Corsairs changed. Before, their fire was weak scattered. Now their bullets are like a solid wall. If they aim at you, you die. Another, from November 3rd, 1943, warning to all pilots. The American fighters have new guns. Their fire is concentrated like a laser. Do not engage Corsairs below 500 meters. Marine pilots started calling their own tracers concentrated death. The sky over the Solomons filled with streaks of light that no one could outmaneuver. Zeros that had once danced gracefully through gunfire now erupted in mid-air, shredded before they could even peel away. But the true miracle wasn't just in kills, it was in survival. Before McCarthy's modification, Marine fighter losses averaged nearly 5 dead pilots every week. Afterward, that number dropped to just over 1. The difference was simple. Pilots could finally hit what they aimed at. They no longer had to linger in dogfights, waste their ammo, or risk diving too deep into enemy formations. And for the first time, the Navy could trust its air cover again. The Solomons campaign stabilized. Amphibious landings that would have been massacres turned into victories. Marine air units could clear skies, protect bombers, and escort convoys without bleeding themselves dry. Somewhere in a command tent, an officer signed an order that simply read, "Adopt VMF 213 seconds convergence configuration. Pending engineering review." It was the quietest revolution of the Pacific War, one that started not with a general's order, but with a sergeant's wrench. When McCarthy finally stumbled out of the hangar that night, grease streaked across his face. The sky above him pulsed faintly red tracer fire from another squadron testing its newly tuned guns. He listened to the sound echoing through the dark. The rhythm of bullets finally flying true. He didn't know it yet. But within weeks, his illegal modification would sweep across every Marine air group in the Pacific, from the Solomons to the Marshalls. The engineers who once called it unsafe would soon rewrite their manuals to call it standard. For now, though, McCarthy just watched the stars fade into dawn and muttered the only prayer he knew: "Let the bastards come." We're ready now. By October 1943, the Solomon sky was no longer a hunting ground for the Japanese. It was a graveyard. The kill ratios flipped overnight. Marine Corsair squadrons that once struggled for every victory were now cutting through enemy formations with clinical precision. What the pilots began calling the McCarthy modification, though officially no one dared use his name, had rewritten the mathematics of air combat. Before the change, it took 890 bullets to bring down one enemy plane after it. Only 190 before. Every kill cost blood. After, it cost a squeeze of the trigger. Captain James Jimmy Sweat became one of the first living proofs. On October 17th, 1943, he engaged 6 Zeros over the island of Vella La Vella. In 4 minutes, he shot down all 6, firing less than 1,000 rounds. He returned to base with ammunition still rattling in his belts enough, he joked, to kill 6 more. Word spread like wildfire across the Pacific. Pilots who once dreaded air patrols began to fly, with a new kind of confidence, not arrogance, but relief. They were no longer haunted by the certainty that their guns would fail them. Lieutenant Robert Hansen, another of the Hellhawks, wrote to his family in January 1944, "There's a sergeant in our squadron who changed everything. He adjusted our guns so they actually hit what we shoot at." Sounds simple, but it's the difference between living and dying up here. He never made it home. But the words would outlive him. Between September and December 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons in the Solomons shot down 487 confirmed Japanese aircraft. Losses? 43. A kill ratio of 1:1. The same legendary number the F-4U Corsair would carry into the history books. The Bureau of Aeronautics eventually performed stress tests on the forbidden configuration and found something ironic. McCarthy's hand-cut reinforcement plates actually improved the structural integrity of the wings. His crude garage fix was not only lethal, it was stronger than the factory design. By February 1944, the modification was officially adopted across the entire Pacific Theater. The same engineers who had dismissed it as impossible now issued a new manual titled Revised Gun Harmonization Procedures, F-4U Series. Its authorship was listed as Bois Engineering Staff. McCarthy's name wasn't there. No medal, no citation, no commendation, just a technical correction quietly folded into the machinery of war. But the pilots knew that Christmas, at the VMF 213 squadron party, Captain Sweat stood and raised his glass. The room was dim, filled with laughter, cigarette smoke, and the smell of rum and oil. He cleared his throat. "Most of you don't know Mickey McCarthy," he began. "Dee's not a pilot. Dee says the guy who loads our bullets and tightens our gun bolts. But I am alive right now because Mickey ignored orders and did what was right instead of what was authorized." The room fell quiet. "I shot down 5 Japanese planes in one mission because my guns actually hit what I aimed at. Every pilot in this squadron owes their life to a sergeant who thought he knew better than the engineers. And turns out, he did." He lifted his glass higher. "To Mickey McCarthy, the deadliest Marine who never pulled a trigger." The hangar erupted in cheers and applause. McCarthy, standing awkwardly in the back, turned red, waving them off with his rag. "I just adjusted some bolts," he muttered. But everyone knew better. Those bolts had saved 800 Marine lives in 4 months. The irony was that McCarthy never asked for recognition. When the war ended, he mustered out quietly in December 1945. No fanfare. No speeches. He went back to Boston, opened a garage, married a school teacher named Helen, and spent the rest of his life fixing carburetors and transmissions the same way Head once fixed a fighter plane's soul. When customers asked if Head done anything important in the Marines, Head shrug and say, "Just loaded ammo, nothing special." But for the men who survived because of him, those words carried the weight of a ghost. In 1989, years after the war, Sweat published his memoir. Head earned the Medal of Honor for actions before McCarthy's modification, but he refused to let the story end there. "I am credited with 15.5 kills, he wrote. "People call me an ace, a hero, a tactician. The truth is simpler. I had a plane with guns that worked the way they should have from the beginning. A sergeant nobody's heard of made that happen. Mickey McCarthy made me an ace. He made all of us aces." He ended the chapter with a quiet fury. The Marine Corps should have given him the Navy Cross. Instead, they gave him nothing. That's not right. But Mickey didn't care about medals. His war was fought in the hangars, under the hum of fluorescent lights, where courage meant turning a wrench and defying a manual. Even after his death in 1979, his name appeared only once in small letters on a bronze plaque at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. It read, "SSG, Michael McCarthy, VMF 213 Ordnance Crew." No story. No explanation. Just the name. But every Marine pilot who sees it knows exactly what it means. They know that aces aren't always the ones who fly. Sometimes they're the ones who make sure the bullets meet. When people talk about the Pacific War now, they remember the big things, the carriers, the battleships, the island names burned into memory like Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. They remember the Corsair itself, that beautiful monster of a plane, all blue and muscle, nicknamed the Whistling Death. But almost no one remembers the night in 1943 when a mechanic with a wrench quietly changed what that plane could do. The truth is, the Corsair didn't become great because of speed or armor. It became great because its bullets finally met where they were supposed to. And that happened not because of generals, engineers, or memos, but because one sergeant refused to accept that missing was normal. In the official version of history, the Bureau of Aeronautics gets the credit. Manuals were revised, data collected, diagrams updated, all presented as the natural progress of military science. But beneath that paperwork, a simple fact hid in plain sight. Mickey McCarthy had solved in one night what hundreds of officers had failed to fix in months. That fix didn't just improve numbers, it saved lives at scale. Every pilot who came home alive between late 1943 and 1945 owed part of his survival to that 300-foot convergence. Analysts later estimated that more than 800 Marines survived direct combat encounters because of McCarthy's adjustment. That's 800 telegrams never sent. 800 families who never got the knock on the door. The effect rippled far beyond the Solomons. The principle of tight convergence became standard across the U.S. arsenal. The P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning all adopted similar short-range harmonization settings based on field results first seen in VMF 213. It even carried into the jet age. Modern fighters like the F-16 and F-35 still obey McCarthy's ghost. Their cannons, the M61 Vulcan and GAU-22, are harmonized for maximum lethality at roughly the same relative distance. Short, brutal, certain. When they fire, every round still converges the way Mickey intended. But the real story isn't about machinery. It's about defiance, the quiet kind that doesn't look heroic. McCarthy never wrote a report. He never gave a speech. He just looked at a problem everyone else had accepted and said, "No, that's wrong." He didn't ask permission to fix it. He just did it because men were dying while the manuals collected dust. And in the end, that's the paradox of war. The military teaches obedience, but survival often depends on disobedience, on the courage to break a rule when the rule itself is killing you. The irony, of course, is that McCarthy never broke the spirit of the Corps. He embodied it. Adapt, improvise, overcome the creed of Marines in every generation. The engineers may have had their data, but McCarthy had his gut, his hands, and his will. But he didn't need medals. His reward was hearing the skies grow quieter. He died in 1979, buried in a small Boston cemetery. His obituary was 3 sentences long. It mentioned that he'd been a Marine. It didn't say that his idea still defines how American pilots shoot 80 years later. At the National Museum of the Marine Corps, if you walk slowly through the aviation wing, you might find a bronze plaque titled Unsung Heroes of Marine Aviation. At the bottom, almost hidden in the fine print, is a name: SSG Michael J. McCarthy, VMF 213, Ordnance Crew. No story. No portrait. Just the name. But pilots stop and look. They always do. They know that every tracer they've ever fired true began with a mechanic who refused to miss, because sometimes the deadliest weapon in a war isn't a gun or a plane. It's the person who knows how to make them finally work. And that's the lesson the brass never wanted to admit, that victory in the Pacific wasn't engineered in boardrooms or command tents. It was welded together, late at night, by a sergeant who thought too much, worked too long, and cared too deeply. Remember Mickey McCarthy. He didn't fly the Corsair. He made it fly straight. He didn't pull the trigger. He made sure it mattered when others did. That's what real innovation looks like. Quiet, stubborn, and absolutely unstoppable.